Hey Lily, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. Perfect. This is the first time I've had a guest using this streaming service, so I'm glad it worked.
Yeah. I think I tried to join the wrong link at first, so I'm glad that it all worked out.
Good, good. I'm happy. I'm glad I resent it then. So how's everything going?
Good,
Good.
good. Um, it's a bit of a weird brain fog day, but
Yeah.
I've drunk all the caffeine that I can at the moment, so
Fantastic.
it's gonna go.
Um,
It's gonna be fine.
Excellent. So what I'm gonna do, I think the audio sounds good, so it seems like all of that is working well.
Mhm.
Thanks for putting on headphones. It does help a lot.
No
Um,
problem.
what I'm going to do is in a few minutes here, I'm going to start the intro, and it's about 5 minutes. So it'll let you kind of set up, get drinks, do whatever you like, and relax. And as soon as that ends, I'll intro the live stream. So it'll just be me. I'll put you over in the green room,
Hmm.
um, introduce the show, introduce you. I'll bring you on, and then we can kind of have a little dialogue if you'd like, and then essentially I'll move to. Um, let's see, how can I want to see. Okay, you can't. You can't hear me off screen. So
Okay.
I tested that out, wanted to see. So I think if now, there we go. So what I'll do is put you on so that you're sort of center in everything,
Hmm.
and that'll allow you to have some time. I'll be here so you're not just staring at yourself, and I'll moderate some questions as they come in.
Okay.
Once you're done, then of course we'll move back to our sort of dialogue here this way,
Hmm.
and then for the last little bit, it'll just be the same thing. We'll get folks who are chiming in either through the chat or through the link for questions,
Hmm.
and really, you know, whoever engages, we'll see how long
Okay.
that goes, but no longer than an hour. So,
Okay.
what I'm going to do, I'm going to start the stream. I'm going to hide you for the moment. Start the little intro, kind of warm up while people get in, and then it's about 5 minutes long. So at about 6:03 your time is when I'll pop back up on the screen. So
Okay.
um, I'll see you shortly.
Sounds good.
Cool. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of 4 lectures for the Disability Movement, Etcetera series. I'm your host, Dr. Andy, and I'm broadcasting today from my office, which is on the University of North Texas campus here in Denton, Texas, which sits on the occupied lands of the Wichita and Caddo affiliated tribes. I am a white male. I use he, him pronouns. I have blonde hair, which is recently cut very short. And I'm presently wearing a nice gray sweater with a white collared shirt and a necklace that my wife had made for myself. And I'm currently standing in front of my bookshelves, which include among all of the books that I use here, some of my favorite things, such as plants, a photo of my wife, and a New Zealand rugby ball back there on the shelf. I'm very excited to welcome everyone who is with us here live and those who are listening afterward. This series has been a real work of passion over the last 18 months. In fact, it's one of the things that's helped me get through the daily monotony and overwhelming anxiety from our new sort of pandemic normal. I hope you'll enjoy the conversations that I'll have with our guests and are able to join into the dialogue. After all, the whole point of disability movement, etc., is to learn from each other and try to move and work toward a more just future. So if you'd like to join into the conversation, please use the hashtag dismove, etc. on Twitter or other social medias, and you can chime in that way. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first guest that we have, Lillie Lainoff. Lillie is a writer, a fencer, and now a writer who writes about fencing. She doesn't quite understand why her parents gave a clumsy 8-year-old a saber, but she's very thankful for it every day. She grew up in Washington, D.C. and graduated from Yale University in 2018, where she was a managing editor of the Yale Daily News magazine. And she was also a writing partner at the Yale Writing Center, as well as a Division I athlete and NCAA championship competitor. She is the founder of Disabled Kid Lit Writers, and her writing has received awards from the Los Angeles Review, Glimmer Train, and the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards, and has been featured in the Washington Post Outlook and the Washington City paper, amongst other places. She's an MA candidate at the University of East Angola in creative writing, prose fiction, and One for All, her debut novel, will be published by FSG in 2022. And with that, I would like to welcome Lillie on with us. Hi, Lillie. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. I really am so excited to hear from you, and I'm excited to hear about your story, and I'm really appreciative that you're one of the first guests. You're one of the first people on this series, so I'm really thankful for joining us.
Yes, no, listening to you talk about the series, it's such an exciting project, and I'm really thankful and honored to be a part of it.
So cool. All right. Well, let's get into it. So just for you and for everybody listening, the show is going to be broken up into 3 parts. The first part, we're going to let Lillie tell us a story. She's going to tell us her experiences from her perspective, mildly touching on physical activity, disability, but she may venture into other topics as well, because that's the point. Everything is interconnected for us. After that, Lillie and I will have a dialogue. I'll do a little interview with her. I sent her a few questions ahead of time, so she's well prepared. And then we will have our, let's see, where can I find it? We'll have some questions, a live Q&A from everybody. And so you can go ahead and submit your questions either in the chat or you can submit them through the link, which is now at the bottom here. So without further ado, Lillie, I will turn it over to you. So please tell us your story.
Yes. Okay, so when thinking about what I was going to talk about for this story, I thought that it would be a good idea to talk about how I got to fencing, because as many people ask me, why fencing? It's not that typical of a sport to hear someone say that they participate in, although it is becoming more popular given the strength of Americans. It's growing more popular in the US given the strength of Americans at the Olympics. And Lee Kiefer, who just won a gold medal in women's foil this past summer. But I started fencing when I was 9 years old with a friend. And what ended up happening was I had tried pretty much every single team sport and individual sport that you can possibly imagine. So my mom used to be a professional ice skater, competitive ice skater when she was a teenager. Tried that. I'm inherently clumsy, so that didn't go very well. I tried soccer, which I love, also not very good at. Softball, not very good at that either. Basketball, track and field, swimming, the list goes on. I just wasn't I wasn't athletic. I loved being a part of team sports and that camaraderie, but I also wasn't very good at it. So I was trying to achieve some sort of balance. And I was at a summer camp, and they brought in people who did various professions. Somebody came in who was a firefighter to talk to us, and for some reason, somebody came in who was a fencer. And I want to make clear here, there are maybe 5 professional fencers in the entire world. This is not a profession. But I was entranced because I loved The Princess Bride and I loved Mulan, and I was so excited to see this person, a woman, coming in to talk to us about fencing. So I asked my mom, please let me try this. And for some reason, my mom said yes. Again, I'm very clumsy. So, giving an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old a sword is not always the choice. But she did it. And I started fencing with a friend. I started with foil. There are 3 different types of fencing tracks. So there's foil, épée, and saber. I'm a saber fencer, but I started off with foil, like many fencers do. And I was the only girl in my class. And that got old very quickly. And I ended up switching fencing clubs. And the only class open that they had was saber. So I became a saber fencer. I started competitively fencing when I was 10 years old. I started going to North American Cups and national events, and the Junior Olympics started when I was 13. During this time, I had injuries, and because I was, again, clumsy, very injury prone, but I only became a disabled athlete, and I didn't even call myself a disabled athlete then, when I was 14 years old, when I was diagnosed with and developed postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is POTS for short. And it's a blood pressure disorder. It's an autonomic nervous system disorder, but it affects your blood pressure and your heart rate. And the best way that I can describe it in the most simple way is when you stand up, your body doesn't really know what to do, and it doesn't maintain homeostasis. So your blood just travels to your extremities, and it doesn't travel up back to your heart. So you can get very dizzy and very sick when you stand up. So add that to fencing. That's difficult. So how we figured out that I was sick, one of the first signs was that I started not being able to hear referees when they said ready fence, because I would have rushing in my ears from symptoms and side effects. I fainted on a strip once after a bout, which, not on my list of fun things, fainting in a convention center in front of, over 1,000 people, especially as a teenage girl. That was not fun. So when I got diagnosed with POTS, I didn't really know what that meant for my fencing. At that point, I was still competing pretty regularly, competitions usually every week or every other weekend. And what we ended up doing was I had an incredible coach, Darius Gilman, who's still my fencing coach. And he developed this style of fencing that he likes to call green fencing, which was the idea of conserving as much energy as possible. So I used to be a very aggressive fencer. I used to attack a lot. I had to shift styles. I had to become a defensive tactician. I had to learn how to rely on parries, which are blocks, and making people fall short instead of attacking. I took a lot of lessons on rolling office chairs when I was too dizzy to stand. And so I kept on fencing. I kept on going to classes. A lot of the time I had to sit on the sidelines and watch everybody fence because I was too dizzy to actually participate. And after a few years went by, I wasn't back at the level that I was at because I was in the top 10 nationally ranked athletes in the country. And I've never regained that ranking, but I was doing well. And I was recruited to college sports, which I had hoped for, but I had never expected. Again, at this point, I'm still not thinking of myself as a disabled athlete. It was only when I wrote an article for the Washington Post Outlook about the Red Band Society, which was a short-lived TV show that I'd watched a promo pilot for, and I was not a fan. And in it, I briefly referenced the fact that I was a fencer. And there was such a wonderful response to the article. And I started learning more about disability in the disability community. I read my first disability theory book, Rosemary Garland Thompson. And I got on Twitter because of my literary agents and because of my book. And all of a sudden, I was introduced to this wonderful world of disability Twitter. And I learned so much about, one, what it meant for other people when I identified myself as a disabled athlete, but also what it meant for me too. And it's completely changed my outlook, both on myself as a fencer and as an athlete. I don't usually describe myself as an athlete, again, because I'm not very athletic. I usually just describe myself as a fencer. But it's completely changed my outlook on how I fence, and also, and yes, what it means, but also what the sport means to me. I think that it's very easy for people to assume that sports for teenagers are either just a way of getting recruited to college, or they're a way to occupy kids' time, or maybe, get energy out or make friends. But for me, it was legitimately, I was able to stand with pots. And when I say stand, I mean literally stand, because my legs were stronger because I was a fencer. And fencing legitimately kept me standing when I was at my most sick. And that significance isn't something that's, even though I'm not at the, in the throes of my worst POTS episodes right now, that symbolism is something that still is very important for me today. Fencing will always be incredibly important to me. And now I coach. I haven't coached recently because of the pandemic in grad school, but I do coach younger kids, so ages like 8 to 12. And that's my story.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I've got lots of questions. But first, you were suggested to me as a guest, and so when you were suggested, then I started looking in and doing some background research, of course, and everything, and in hearing your story, it's interesting, particularly around the piece of your acquired disability. That was not something I had known. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you had brought up the idea that even as though you started to develop POTS, that you still never considered yourself disabled or a disabled athlete. And I have a very similar experience. I've until recently hadn't identified as disabled, though I have ADHD and depression. And so, but I think very much in your way, it was almost an empowering kind of action. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to that piece of it.
Right. So I think that one, the act of reclaiming the word disabled, there are so many really wonderful activists who are doing work, like the Say the Word hashtag, and just doing a lot of work to make people or help people understand that disability isn't a bad word, it isn't a bad thing. In fact, for whoever's listening, if you're not disabled, please do away with the special abilities. If I had special abilities, I would be flying or walking through walls.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or, you know, the euphemisms. It's fine to say disabled. It's not a bad word. And before I knew all this, I cast myself in my mind as my own super crit, which for those listening who don't know what that is, it's pretty much every disabled like athlete who like is overcomes their disability, and I use overcomes in quotation marks because the disability isn't going anywhere. It's still there.
Yeah.
Just because I win a fencing bout doesn't mean my POTS magically is cured. It's still there. But I had done this, I had worked myself up in my mind because I didn't consider myself disabled because I saw the Paralympics on TV and I said, oh, those people are disabled. I'm not. And that's not, it's not that anybody was telling me that specifically. It's just the way that society is. Like we learned that from a very young age. And it took a lot of unlearning of that. But I also thought about it as in terms of like, oh, look at what I'm overcoming. Look how, you know, great this is. And it took me until I was in my 20s in college to realize, hold on, you know, one, my POTS isn't going anywhere. But two, it's almost a performance. This act of pretending that, you know, oh, look at me, I can fence about, you know, like, let's all clap for the disabled girl, yay. That's not what I want. That's not what I want for myself, and that's not what I want for other disabled athletes, and it's not what I want for other disabled people. If I can help inspire, and I know that inspire is a loaded word, but if I can help inspire young disabled girls to continue participating in sports, that's great. I'd love to do that. But I don't need to inspire any non-disabled people to say, oh, Lillie can fence. That means that, you know, I should be able to run a marathon because if Lillie can fence, then surely I should be able to do X, Y, and Z. That's not how it works.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of that, yeah, I think it's immensely powerful, the idea of role models. And in thinking of the same thread, you know, as you were still fencing and as you were sort of coming to terms with your own disability and identity as a disabled athlete, did you have role models? Who were you able to look to, whether it's, you know, the big time folks or just even people in your own circle?
So I had role models within the disability community, and then I had role models who were fencers. I didn't really have role models who were disabled fencers. I have a few. I know of one person whose name I'm not going to mention because I don't know if she is open about her disability or not, but she's been a role model for me. But for me, it was more about finding disabled activists that I could look up to, and then trying to apply the way that they approach their own disability to how I approach thinking about my disability within the context of fencing, within the context of athletics. So, and then there's also the complicated notion of the fact that with sports, I mean, there's so many sports injuries. So many people who play sports right now who are professional athletes are disabled. Yeah. They just don't call themselves disabled. And I mean, if we look at like, you know, post-concussion syndrome, if we look at like all these different things that athletes have, I mean, the percentage of athletes who are disabled is probably higher than the average population.
Likely, yeah.
But none of us talk about it, and none of, you know, it's only something that gets talked about after you retire. So I didn't really have anybody to look up to in that context. But in terms of disability rights activists, Alice Wong has been an incredible source for me, just in terms of helping me, one, feel accepted within the disability community, but two, also just she's so incredibly generous with her time, and that was helpful. In terms of, there's also disability rights activists within the literary community and within the kidlit community, like Marieke Nijkamp, and they're wonderful as well. So it was mostly just about me trying to find, people who I can look up to them, I can look up to her, and then in terms of athletes, I look up to my coaches and the fencers that I fence with.
I have to say, fencing is not a sport that a Midwestern kid like myself grows up around. And in fact, it wasn't a thing of course I knew fencing existed, right? But it wasn't ever a thing I saw until I did my PhD at UVA. And they, of course, used the gym where my office was tucked in some back corner. And it's an immensely delicate sport, yet very physical. And I wonder if how your experiences with your particular disability, with the fact that standing and moving quickly can cause you to have some issues, obviously related to the competition. So I know you mentioned already sort of some of the strategies in changing your style to better match your disability. Was there other things that you needed to find ways to adapt or accommodate for?
Right. So I have to drink so much water. So much water. I mean, to be fair, most of us aren't drinking enough water. Most of us should be drinking more water, but I have to drink a lot of water. One, to stay hydrated, but two, because that affects blood pressure, that affects the autonomic nervous system. So I have to drink a lot of water, which is difficult because you're running to the bathroom in full fencing gear and trying to use the restroom and then running back and trying to fence and then running again. But there's also, I have to adapt my medication schedule. So I don't normally get up at 6 a.m. in the morning. But for fencing competitions, sometimes that's what's required of me because the check-in time or the end of check-in time is at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. and I have to get up at 6 a.m., which means that my medication schedule for my blood pressure is shifted many hours earlier. Then there's the issue of the fact that when I'm fencing for 5 hours, my metabolism is sped up, which means that I'm going to process my medication more quickly, which means that you have to shrink the time in between when you're taking the medication. There's so much math involved in this, and as somebody who doesn't like math and is not good at math, it's a bit stressful. I also had to I had to learn how to accept when I needed to stop fencing, when I get injured, when I need to take a break. That's difficult, and I think that for athletes especially, there's this culture of just getting through it, just pushing through it, just pushing through that game or that bout or until it's fine.
No pain, no gain. Right?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you have to stop because you're compounding the issue even more. So I had to learn when to say, okay, just gonna take a break. And sometimes that meant, means I practice only fencing about, and that's frustrating. But I know my body, and it's better for me to take care of it in the best way that I know how, and not continue to push myself to the point where I'm so dizzy that I accidentally injure myself, which is always a concern. One of the other things that is unique to fencing is the mesh mask, which I think that a lot of people, there's this, I think people liken it to like beekeeper outfits, but, and I have people ask me, oh, that must be so difficult to see through, and it really isn't, unless you have POTS or another condition that affects your vision. So what would happen is when I put on the mask, the mesh just looks like solid gray. So it ended up being that I had to learn how to feel the rhythms of the bout and not necessarily be able to see what my opponent was doing, but being able to sense it and guess and read what was happening without that sense, without being able to necessarily see perfectly, which was difficult. There used to be visor masks. You'll probably, if you look up fencing, you might see some strange pictures from the bygone era visor masks that are like this clear visor. But those got banned because they're dangerous and they shatter sometimes, so that's not great.
Probably a good reason.
Yeah, so I used to use one of those, and that was very helpful for me. But then that strategy was taken away from me, so I had to learn how to work with a mesh mask. Yeah. I think that, like anything with disability and chronic illness, you're always having to come up with new strategies, because there is going to be a day when you wake up and one of the strategies that you've relied on just does not work. It just won't work, and you have to come up with a new one. So it has led me to become a lot more adaptive to whatever situation that I'm in.
For sure. Now, as a senior, you were one of the first physically disabled athletes to individually qualify for any NCAA championship event. Was that just in fencing, or was that just overall individual events?
Overall individual events.
Wow.
Now, I also want to point out that that's just openly disabled, openly physically disabled. I don't know how many people are actually, again, because as I mentioned earlier, there's this culture of, really don't talk about disability. And yes, that's true just in general. And that's the problem that society deals with in general, but really, really within the athletic community.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've experienced it regularly, all the way up, even through my sporting experiences. Could you talk about your experiences of being a first and what that meant for your career?
So it's funny because I didn't really talk about this in my story at the beginning, but I think it's relevant to say that when I was a freshman, I missed NCAA championship qualification by one spot. I was the alternate for the Northeast region. And at that point, I hadn't even considered championships as a possibility. I wasn't a highly sought after recruit. I was just there because I got good grades and I felt okay, and I was going to help the team. That was all that I was supposed to do. I was never supposed to be somebody who qualified for NCAA championships, regardless of my disability or not. So when I almost qualified freshman year, and I was so heartbroken when I didn't, I thought, oh, wait a second, I actually do really want this a lot. I had a pretty significant back and SI joint injury when I was a sophomore, and my fencing suffered because of that. So by the time I was fencing senior year, I wasn't fencing as well as I was freshman year. And regionals came around, and they were at Yale for the first time in whoever knows how long. And I thought, what a wonderful way to end my collegiate career as an athlete. I'm going to get to fence in my home gym. My friends stayed an extra day, and instead of going on spring break, and they got up at like 8 a.m. to watch me fence, which is awesome. My parents got to come up, my little brother got to come up, and my little brother was heckling other fencers, which was not great.
I'm sure that's not well approved in the fencing community.
I mean, it was nice. It wasn't mean heckling. It was him insulting the Columbia fencers who wear one powder blue sock and one white sock. And going, why can't you get your socks to match? But stuff like that.
The most polite of heckling.
The most polite of heckling. And I kept on making it through the rounds. And how regionals works is you fence one pool bout, and then they reseed everybody, and they eliminate however many at the bottom, and then you fence another pool round, which is like 6 people, 6 bouts, so that's 30 touches minimum. Okay. Most of the time, each bout, you're fencing at least 15, 20 touches. And then they cut people off, they reseed you again, you fence again. It is the most hellish competition event that fencers have. I heard that one Olympian said that the Olympics has nothing on Northeast regionals, and like Olympians have literally been vomiting into trash cans during regionals because it's so long.
It sounds like it.
So the final round is a round of 12. So you fence 11 other people. And by that point, you're just so exhausted. And my freshman year, I made that final round. And my senior year, I was the last cutoff and I made it. I said, oh, that's kind of funny. I mean, I didn't think anything was going to come of it. And I fenced fine. And I was walking by the bout committee, which is where you drop off results and they convene the referees. And somebody said, oh, see you in Indianapolis. And I turned around and I said, wait, what do you mean? And he said, well, you qualified for NCAA championships. And I just collapsed to the ground and started crying. And my parents were crying, like my little brother was crying, everybody was crying. I didn't know, I think, how much it meant to me until that moment. Again, because I just hadn't thought it. It wasn't supposed to be for me. Like that wasn't supposed to happen. And then I went to NCAA championships. I did not do very well, but it was a very good experience. And I'm glad that I went, and I'm glad that I had the chance. And I think that it's, the idea of first is always difficult. So I also have that issue with my book that's coming out in next year, because it's the first traditionally published book by a major publisher with a main character with POTS syndrome. Now, that itself is alarming, given the number of people who have POTS. There's millions, but it's alarming, and it's not like, oh, I'm the first person to do this or the first person to try this. It's like, no, so much of it is luck, is timing, it's being in the right place at the right time. And none of this can happen without other people who paved the way. So I couldn't have gotten to the point where I could say, I'm going to have this book without other disabled authors publishing in Kidlit. And the same thing goes for fencing. I had to see other fencers succeeding and doing well, not necessarily disabled athletes, but I saw other fencers succeeding, and me wanting to really do that, and having coaches who believed in me, and my family who really believed in me, and that's what it took.
Wow. Yeah. So that gets to my next question of, and you kind of touched on it, but what do you attribute to your successes that you've had, particularly with fencing, but also in extension of that afterward as a writer?
Right. I really love fencing. If you can't tell, I really love fencing, and I think that there are, unfortunately, a lot of athletes who don't love their sport for whatever reason, because they feel like they're pushed into it and they never really wanted to be doing that sport, or because it's something that they have to do for a profession, and that takes the joy out of it sometimes. But for me, love of fencing always got me through. In addition to that, like I said, my coach, who developed green fencing for me, who didn't just say, like, this girl is sick and I'm just not going to spend time with her. I'm not going to, worry about how she does the competitions. I'm just going to focus on my other students. He didn't do that. So he didn't have to give me lessons. He didn't have to give me lessons in a rolling office chair, but he did. And then also my family. My family kept on, taking me to fencing competitions, even though they knew there was a very high possibility that I would just be sick and I wouldn't be able to do very well. And now that comes with privilege, because my family was able to do that, and that is a privilege. But that support enabled me to continue fencing and continue through the worst POTS episodes until I could get to a point where I was actually, doing better. In terms of writing, I have like a similar, again, my family is very supportive. I've always wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a writer since I was 5 years old. So there was never really any option in my mind of doing anything else. And I'm very stubborn. So that led itself into resiliency, in terms of saying, okay, I'm just going to approach this like I approached POTS, like I approached fencing, every publisher rejection, going to get through it. And I spent 3 years on submission to editors with my novel. And I got a lot of, we're not sure if this is marketable, which is code for, I'm not sure if people want to read a book about a disabled person. So I think that, I think in some family, coaches, and then also I have really wonderful friends who are writers, whether they're disabled or not, who have offered an incredible support system for me. So Tracy Dion and Sabina Post and Melissa C. and Carla Leibowitz and Gabe Moses, and there are all these people. And like I said earlier, Marie Nishkamp, there are all these people who have supported me, and I've supported them in turn. But there's a solidarity in terms of what we're going through, because it is difficult. And then there's also disabled kidlit writers, which has offered an incredible amount of support for me, and I've been able to support other people through that. And I mean, we have over 350 members now, which I could have never predicted when I started it. Was it? So it would have been 20. So yeah, it was like 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. Wow. I could have never predicted that. And there's a huge populace of disabled writers who are trying to break into publishing and trying to break into this industry, and being able to talk to them about what I'm going through and what everybody else is going through, it shows you that you're not alone. And it shows you also when you see the very successful disabled authors who are in the group, for example, like Marie Nishkamp, it says, maybe I can do it too. And that's kind of the inverse of the whole entire super crypt inspiration porn kind of inspiring thing. Like I talked about earlier, it's a good thing when disabled people get to see disabled people doing really well and succeeding at something they want to do, because it shows us that there is a way through the minefield that is, ableism and other, intersections with ableism, whether it's racism or sexism or any other ism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that perfect segue into my next question of, at any time did you face resistance to your participation in fencing?
Yes. Not while I was in high school necessarily. I mean, I still, to this day, there are fencers who know that I'm disabled, and they'll try to get me in trouble with the referee if I take my mask off for like 10 seconds for a breather, which is upsetting to me on a number of levels, because I'm like, you know me, I'm not faking, which is a whole nother topic of discussion, which I could talk about for an hour. And I think that also, because I was once I started openly talking about disability in undergrad, I think that made some fencers incredibly uncomfortable. And that's not their fault necessarily. I think that's just, again, society and how we talk about disability. And I think that, everybody has to grow and learn and be given the opportunity to grow and learn. But there were always issues. I think the biggest issue was not being believed when I said, I am okay to fence right now. So I think that there's a lot of, and this is true of pretty much, this dynamic is true in most aspects of disabled people's lives, whether it's within, when they're talking to doctors or when you're talking to teachers. It's the idea of people thinking that they know your body better than you do. And I have nothing to gain by lying to say, oh yeah, I'm fine, but oh no, I'm not. And here I'm going to go, I don't want to faint on a fencing strip. That's not, and I want my team to do well. I want my school to do well. And at the end of the day, more so than, having that first of being the, one of the first physically disabled athletes to individually qualify for an NCAA championship event. At the end of my senior year, Yale women's fencing cracked the top 10 in the national rankings. And that wasn't something that we had been anywhere close to for many years. And that was huge. And that to me is as an individual, I could be incredibly happy about the NCAA championship qualification. But as a teammate, as a Yale fencer, that statistic, that saying, oh, we cracked the top 10, that's a big deal.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. As a disabled athlete, participating with non-disabled peers, right? Because typically when we talk to folks who are disabled athletes, they're typically not participating with non-disabled peers in the traditional sense in most sports, right? At least those who identify as disabled or would identify. Did you ever feel pressure to perform or act in a certain way? I know you talked a little bit about the idea of supercrip, but were there any other things that you noticed in your time that, just some kind of pressure from non-disabled peers, whether on your team or, from others?
I mean, I think that it's hard to say. I think that I definitely did feel pressure to not talk about my condition a lot. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with fencing. I mean, I still remember, all of us have, those awful high school memories of, oh gosh, that one person said something really awful to me one time, and they probably have no idea that they said it and don't remember it now, but I remember every single word and every single moment, every single, little second of that moment. But I still remember when I first got diagnosed and somebody was asking me about it, and I said, oh, do you want me to explain? I can tell you about it. And they're like, no. And they laughed and they walked away. And that was such a foundational moment for me in terms of, I left for college having decided I'm not going to tell anybody that I have POTS. I'm not going to tell anybody that I'm chronically ill or disabled. And of course that went out the window in a few days because it's very difficult to hide something like that.
Absolutely.
But, you learn, you intake this feedback, right, of how people treat you when you're open about your chronic illness and disability. And it's especially hard as a teenager when you're still trying to figure out who you are as a person, at the same time as you're trying to figure out how to navigate this world in a body that is kind of failing you for the first time. You learn and you try to adapt, and that adaptation sometimes leads to you wanting to not talk about it. Again, I think that it helped the fact that, I came into the disability community and fully accepted myself when I was in my 20s, and I was less worried about what other people would think. And I think that it's very easy to say, oh, I don't care about what other people think. And I think that, some people say that, but I think it's more about, I care about what other people think when I care about those people. If I care about those people, everybody else doesn't. That doesn't matter in the end. So that was when I was able to fully actually talk about disability, and within the context of fencing.
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to be mindful of time. We've been I could talk to you for a long time about this, but I also want to make sure those who are watching in right now get a chance to ask any questions they may have. So if you're watching, you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. You can also use the link that's on your screen to submit a question. And while those are coming in, I'm going to ask another one because I still have a million. I know you've fenced, and you continue to fence, and you still fence competitively and coach. And you said at the beginning you did try other sports. I wonder, are there other activities or sports that you come to enjoy now as a young adult?
less so in me doing them and more so watching them. I'm a huge Tottenham and Brentford fan.
Mm,
Thanks to my little brother who interned with the Brentford Community Trust, which is a wonderful group doing wonderful things
oh,
for
cool.
the Brentford community
Yeah.
and the surrounding area. And Brentford qualified for the Premier League this year, which was stunning because this hasn't happened in over 50 years.
Snaps for
Um,
that.
so we've been watching. Today they won their Caribou Cup game 7-0. So
Oh,
we
so
are,
cool.
yes. So I enjoy watching that. I've also really gotten into watching ice skating with my mom
Mm,
because, she was so passionate about it when she was a teenager. So it's nice to share that with her. Um, I love watching the Olympics, like I think most people do.
mm,
Um, but there aren't many other activities per se that I think that I've tried doing. I've always, and again, a lot of this comes down to chronic illness and disability. It's, how much energy do I have? You know, what am I going to use it on? And for me,
mm,
that's always been fencing.
mm,
If I'm going to use any of my physical energy, it's going to be for fencing. So
yeah.
I haven't really explored any other sports. And that's also because, again, I've mentioned this probably 3 or 4 times right by now, but I'm very clumsy. So there is always the risk of when I try
Hmm.
a new sport, I injure myself and then I can't
Yeah.
fence.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Not personally, but my coach had in college had like a long-standing rule of nobody being able to do IM sports during the season because people had broken wrists before and then
Hmm.
couldn't fence. That being said, after season was over, I was the co-ed IM team captain or co-captain for dodgeball for my residential college for 3 years, and it was great. um,
Fantastic.
yeah,
Yeah.
dodgeball, the sport that you hate as a little kid, but it's actually really fun as an adult.
I, as a former physical educator, I have nothing against dodgeball, but there's so many better ways to teach those skills in school. If adults want to get together and do it,
Yeah,
absolutely. It's hilariously fun. I enjoy
yeah,
playing dodgeball,
yeah.
but that's fantastic. Is there anything that you either wish you could have done or you something you want to try in the future that maybe has inspired you but you haven't had a chance yet?
Um, hmm. I've always wondered what wheelchair fencing would be like because there
Hmm.
are wheelchair fencers who don't use wheelchairs regularly, but because they're disabled, they they wheelchair fence. And I've always
Hmm.
wondered if, and the way that wheelchair fencing works is you have to keep the lower half of your body on the chair.
Hmm.
So that levels the playing ground
Hmm.
because that way, for people who are paralyzed from the waist up or from the hips up, they're not competing against somebody who can reach out of their chair and lean all the way over. You always have you lose the point. You get penalized if you don't stay seated. So that's something that I've always been interested in because it might be interesting to try fencing when I'm not dizzy from standing up.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's a
yeah,
whole nother way of of competing,
yeah.
right?
I don't have any plans to do that anytime in the future because I like fencing, how I fence.
Hmm.
And there aren't a lot of to the surprise of no one, there aren't a lot of opportunities for wheelchair fencing.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, there are wonderful clubs and wonderful coaches. They're just not as prevalent as fencing clubs, and
Yeah.
fencing clubs aren't that prevalent to begin with. So,
Typically not. Yeah.
mhm.
So, how have in what ways has sport impacted you just overall? What relationship has it have with your personal life, your writing, and even some of your advocacy? How does it extend to those areas?
Right, right. I think that it's always strange to be an athlete in a writer's space
Mm.
because lots of writers are, I mean, let's be fair, we're all nerds. Um,
Yeah.
and I say that proudly. I'm a proud nerd.
Same.
But a lot of people will talk about, oh, I hate sports or I'm super non athletic. And I'm like, yeah, I'm also not athletic, but I also do sports. Or I'm also a fencer and I'm a writer. I think that also it's given me opportunities in terms of writing because my first book is a gender bent retelling of the Three Musketeers. So I am getting to write duel scenes and fencing scenes and getting to use my very specific knowledge in order to write better. And I also did for a time Fencing Fridays, which was my attempt to teach writers how to write about fencing and sword fighting and dueling accurately because I love writers so much. I love the books that are coming out, but oh my goodness, so many of them are so inaccurate. And every single time I see somebody use the word lunge in a defensive context, I cringe. Because you lunge towards somebody with a sword, you don't lunge away.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So I did a bit of that. I think that fencing specifically taught me a lot about resilience and focus. And I think that I definitely applied that to my writing and, waiting for publishers to get back to me, persevering through that. And also to my advocacy. And I think that, fencing has made me a much better person. And it's strange to even talk about how sport has affected me and how fencing has affected me because I'm 26 now. I've fenced since I was, 8, 9 years old. That's most of my life. I don't really remember a time when I wasn't fencing. So I don't really remember a me without fencing. So
yeah, I mean, it's just such a part of who you are, and it's been that way for so long, right? And that to me is the impact, right? I don't think, having listened to you now, I don't think, I think sport has had just such a positive role for you, and I wonder, how do you feel we could make it so that Lillies in the future, other kids who may go through, maybe they are born with a disability or they acquire a disability at some point in their life, how do we make it so that they can have success, have joy in the sport and get those same experiences?
Right. So I will preface this by saying that I think that there is a little bit more awareness coming to the field in terms of the stigma and oppression that disabled athletes face. As a coach, I have to go through, a fencing coach, I have to go through safe sport training every year to renew my coaching license membership. And the first thing that popped up on this year's was that, did you know that disabled kid athletes are much more likely to face harassment than other athletes? And I had never seen anybody talking about that statistic before. And it made me want to cry because I was just like, this is finally being recognized is important. I think that also something that's important is as coaches are, and again, this is something that's being, you have to unlearn this. And I think that coaches are having to unlearn this idea of, if somebody says, oh, my ankle hurts, or if a kid routinely gets injuries, it's not necessarily that they're faking. Maybe they have Ehlers-Danlos, maybe they have a joint issue, maybe they have POTS. There are so many different, or maybe they just get injuries a lot. That's also a legitimate thing. But understanding that kids, they know their bodies too. They understand what's happening to them, and we need to stop assuming that they're lying about different injuries and how they're feeling. And I think that would have helped me a lot because I think, when you have a kid who says, oh, I don't feel well, a lot, you just kind of assume that they're faking. And I think I didn't really have the language to use in terms of POTS. I thought that everybody, when they stood up, completely got blackout vision and didn't see and, got dizzy. I didn't know that was something that didn't happen. I didn't know. So one, awareness would be helpful, and talking about POTS is helpful, and getting people to understand it. Even in the time since I've been diagnosed, there's a lot more awareness about POTS. And I think that also because it is one of the side effects of long COVID, there will be even more continued awareness of POTS in upcoming months and in the future years. But I think that would be helpful. I think that also helping kids understand that acquiring a disability doesn't mean that they have to stop being an athlete. Athleticism and disability aren't mutually exclusive. They can exist together in the same body in the same sentence. They're not things that have to be separate. And I think that if somebody had told me that when I was younger, I think that would have meant a lot. And I think that it would have been nice to know that, especially when I had to sit on the sidelines, when I had to watch my friends fence and I couldn't fence. That would have meant a lot to me.
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic place to end on, and a great period as a part of the first of these lecture series. Lillie, I thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your experiences with us. I've learned a lot. I hope those listening in have as well. You've certainly given me a lot to think about too.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lillie. Thank you, everybody. Again, I'd like to thank our guest, Lillie Lainoff, for being the first. We're here. We did it. It's through. We're live. You're watching it. We're listening in. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you did too. You can order Lillie's book, One for All, now. You can find it at the link. I'll also link it in the show notes. Her book you can be found wherever you can pre-order books, or wherever books are sold in the U.S., and you can find it on Book Depository and Amazon for international pre-orders. If you missed any part of today's conversation, you can watch the replay here on YouTube, or you can listen to the whole show as a podcast, which I'll be releasing very soon. Hopefully, you'll be able to listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts in the near future. As a reminder, this was the first of 4 lectures that I have planned for this fall. You can find more shows coming up on my Luma page, which again will be linked in the notes below. It's LU.MA/that hippie prof. You can find the other shows that are coming up. You can register, that way you never miss out. If you'd like to support this show as well as some others that I'm working on, you can find my Patreon. It's again /that hippie prof. Again, I'd like to thank Adrian Bluss for composing the music for this show for today, that you heard at the beginning and you'll hear a little bit here at the end. And with that, thank you all for being here. I'm happy you're here. I really hope you join me next time. See you later.